The dust kicked up by the convoy's wheels hung in the air like a brown curtain, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that found its way into every crevice of equipment and clothing. Sarah Chun wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand, leaving a streak of mud across her skin. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the medical truck where she sat checking and rechecking her supplies for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 26, Sarah had been deployed for 8 months now, serving as a field medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. Her medical bag sat between her feet, perfectly organized despite the constant jostling of the vehicle. Morphine, bandages, tourniquets, saline bags, antibiotics, everything had its place, and she could find any item blindfolded. This obsessive organization had saved lives more times than she could count. The radio crackled to life, breaking through the monotonous hum of the engine. Approaching Checkpoint Alpha, ETA 15 minutes to forward operating base, came the voice of Sergeant Rodriguez, their convoy commander. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before every mission. Today, they were establishing a temporary medical station near a village that had been reporting increased insurgent activity. Sarah's journey to this dusty corner of Afghanistan had begun 3 years earlier in a trauma unit in Chicago. She had been working the night shift when a gang shooting brought in 6 victims simultaneously. As chaos erupted around her, Sarah found herself moving with a calm precision that surprised even her veteran colleagues. She stabilized 3 patients who weren't expected to survive, earning praise from the chief of surgery and sparking something inside her, a desire to help in the most desperate circumstances. When her younger brother Marcus enlisted in the Army, Sarah felt called to serve as well. But instead of following a traditional path, she chose to become a combat medic. Her family thought she was crazy. Her mother cried for 3 days when Sarah announced her decision. Her father, a retired police officer, understood better than most the drive to serve others, but he still worried constantly. Basic training had been brutal. Sarah's 5'4" frame and slight build made her an easy target for doubters, but she proved herself quickly. She could carry a wounded soldier twice her weight, navigate obstacle courses loaded down with medical equipment, and maintain her composure under simulated combat stress that left others shaking. Her instructors noted her unusual ability to compartmentalize fear and focus entirely on the medical task at hand. The convoy slowed as they approached the checkpoint. Sarah could see Afghan National Army soldiers manning the position, their AK-47s slung casually across their shoulders as they waved the American vehicles through. These partnerships with local forces were crucial to their mission, but trust didn't come easily in a war zone where allegiances could shift like the desert sand. Remember, we're here to help the locals. Lieutenant Hayes had briefed them that morning. Hearts and minds people. Every person we treat is potentially saving the lives of our brothers and sisters down the road. Sarah took this mission seriously. She had seen the difference medical care could make not just in saving lives, but in building relationships with communities that had grown wary of foreign soldiers. As they crested a small hill, the village came into view. Mud brick buildings clustered around a central market area where she could see people going about their daily business despite the military presence. Children ran between the buildings, their laughter carrying on the wind despite the poverty that was evident everywhere. It reminded Sarah why she was here, not for politics or strategy, but for the simple human desire to help those in need. The convoy pulled into the designated area for their temporary base, a cleared section on the outskirts of a village that provided good visibility in all directions. Sarah jumped down from the truck and immediately began directing the setup of the medical station. Her team included Corporal Jackson, a young man from Texas who had trained as an EMT before joining the Army, and Specialist Williams, a former nursing student whose gentle manner with patients contrasted sharply with her tough exterior. Within an hour, they had established a functional field hospital under a large tent. Sarah arranged the treatment areas with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to organizing her medical bag. Triage area near the entrance, surgical supplies in the center where they could be easily accessed, and recovery space toward the back where patients could rest safely. Word spread quickly through the village that American medics were offering free medical care. Sarah's first patient was an elderly man with an infected wound on his leg that had been bothering him for weeks. As she cleaned and dressed the injury, she worked through a translator to learn that he had stepped on a piece of rusty metal while working in his small garden. The antibiotics she gave him would likely save his leg, possibly his life. Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of patients arrived. A pregnant woman concerned about complications, children with various cuts and infections, an elderly woman whose diabetes medication had run out weeks ago. Each case reinforced Sarah's belief that medicine could bridge cultural and political divides in ways that weapons never could. As evening approached, Sarah noticed increased radio chatter from the perimeter guards. Nothing specific, just the heightened alertness that came when intelligence suggested possible insurgent movement in the area. She continued working, but found herself listening more carefully to the sounds around them. The call to prayer from the village mosque, the distant sound of helicopters, the casual conversation of soldiers setting up defensive positions. Corporal Jackson approached her as she was treating a young boy with a broken wrist. "Doc, Rodriguez wants to see you when you finish up here," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, carefully applying the splint while explaining through the translator how the boy's mother should care for the injury over the next few weeks. When she met with Sergeant Rodriguez at the command post, his expression was serious. "Intelligence is picking up chatter about possible activity tonight," he explained. "Nothing confirmed, but we need to be ready for anything. Can your medical station be secured quickly if we need to move?" Sarah considered the layout they had established. "We can pack the essential supplies in under 10 minutes, but we've got patients who shouldn't be moved immediately. The pregnant woman is showing signs of preterm labor, and I got that elderly man on 4 antibiotics for his leg infection." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Do what you can to stabilize them, but be ready to evacuate if necessary. I'm doubling the perimeter guards and calling for air support on standby." As he spoke, Sarah could see soldiers checking their weapons and adjusting body armor. The relaxed atmosphere of the afternoon was shifting into something more tense and focused. Sarah returned to the medical station and quietly briefed her team on the situation. They began organizing supplies so critical items could be grabbed immediately if evacuation became necessary. She also started planning which patients could be safely moved and which would require her to stay behind if worse came to worst. As darkness fell over the village, Sarah continued treating patients by the light of battery-powered lanterns. The pregnant woman's contractions were becoming more regular, and Sarah was growing concerned about complications if they had to evacuate suddenly. She had assisted with emergency deliveries before, but never in a potential combat zone. The radio crackled with routine check-ins from the perimeter guards. "Checkpoint 1, all clear. Checkpoint 2, nothing to report." But Sarah noticed the intervals between checks getting shorter, and she could see soldiers moving with more purpose than earlier in the day. Something was definitely building out there in the darkness beyond their defensive perimeter. Around midnight, Sarah was checking on the elderly man with the leg infection when she heard the first shot. It was distant but unmistakable, the sharp crack of a rifle echoing across the desert. Within seconds, the radio exploded with chatter as guards reported muzzle flashes in multiple directions. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She began moving patients to the most protected area of the medical tent while her team secured critical supplies. "Medic needed at checkpoint 3. The radio call came just as Sarah was helping the pregnant woman to a more secure position. The woman was clearly in active labor now, her contractions coming every few minutes. Sarah faced an impossible choice: stay with a woman in childbirth or respond to wounded soldiers who might be dying. "Jackson, Williams, you're with the woman." "I'll be back as soon as possible," she called out, grabbing her medical bag and running toward the sound of gunfire. As she moved through the darkness, guided only by the dim glow of red flashlights marking safe paths, Sarah could hear the distinctive whine of bullets passing overhead. This wasn't just harassment fire. Someone was making a coordinated attack on their position. At checkpoint 3, she found 2 soldiers wounded by shrapnel from what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade that had exploded nearby. Neither injury was immediately life-threatening, but both men needed attention. As Sarah worked to stop bleeding and stabilize their conditions, she could hear the firefight intensifying around them. Radio reports indicated at least 20 insurgents approaching from multiple directions. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Their small force was designed for medical support, not sustained combat. Sarah realized they might be overrun before air support could arrive. As she finished treating the wounded soldiers, helping them to more secure positions, she made her way back toward the medical station. The pregnant woman needed her, and she had to ensure her patients could be evacuated safely. But as Sarah approached the medical tent, she saw muzzle flashes much closer than they should have been. Someone had breached their defensive perimeter. The war had just become very personal, and her role was about to change from healer to something she had never expected to become. The muzzle flashes were coming from behind the generator that powered their medical equipment, maybe 30 yards from where Sarah crouched behind a concrete barrier. Through the darkness, she could make out at least 3 figures moving between the vehicles of their convoy, clearly inside what should have been secure perimeter. Her mind raced as she processed the implications. If insurgents had penetrated this far, her patients were in immediate danger. Sarah's medical training had included combat scenarios, but she had never expected to face a situation where she would need to actively engage enemies to protect her patients. The Hippocratic oath she had taken seemed to echo in her mind. First, do no harm. But what happened when the only way to prevent harm to innocent people was to cause harm to others? She keyed her radio with trembling fingers. This is Doc Shun. I have enemy movement inside the perimeter near the medical station. Multiple insurgents between me and my patients. The response came immediately from Sergeant Rodriguez, his voice tense with the controlled urgency of a professional soldier under fire. Copy that. Document air support is still 10 minutes out. Can you reach your patients safely? Sarah studied the terrain between her position and the medical tent. The insurgents were positioned perfectly to intercept anyone trying to reach the wounded and sick people under her care. She could see the glow of lanterns inside the tent, where Jackson and Williams were presumably still helping the woman in labor. Negative, Rodriguez. They're blocking the direct route. I count at least 3, possibly more. As she spoke, Sarah heard a scream from inside the medical tent. Whether from pain of childbirth or something worse, she couldn't tell. The sound galvanized her into action in a way that all her training couldn't match. Someone under her care needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. Sarah checked her sidearm, a Beretta M9 pistol that she had qualified with but never fired in combat. During training, she had been a decent shot, but nothing exceptional. Her instructors had focused more on her medical skills, assuming that she would rarely, if ever, need to use her weapon in actual combat. Now, as she checked the magazine and chamber, she wished she had spent more time on the firing range. Moving carefully in the darkness, Sarah began working her way around the perimeter of the insurgent position. Her plan was simple: reach the medical tent from an unexpected direction and evacuate her patients. She had no intention of engaging in combat unless absolutely necessary. Every instinct told her to wait for the soldiers to handle the threat, but the sounds coming from the tent convinced her that waiting might mean watching people die who could be saved. The Afghan night was surprisingly cold, and Sarah's breath formed small clouds as she moved between pieces of equipment and supply containers. She had trained for night movement, but the reality was far more disorienting than any exercise. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might be footsteps approaching her position. Her medical bag, which she had instinctively grabbed when leaving cover, felt heavier with each step. As Sarah rounded the corner of a supply truck, she nearly walked into an insurgent who was apparently trying to flank the main defensive positions. The man was dressed in dark clothing and carrying an AK-47, focused intently on something ahead of him. For a moment that seemed to last forever, they stared at each other in mutual surprise. Then, training took over for both of them. The insurgent started to swing his rifle toward Sarah, but her proximity gave her a crucial advantage. Without thinking, she lunged forward with her medical bag, striking him across the face and neck with the heavy equipment inside. The man stumbled backward, and Sarah drew her pistol with a speed that surprised her. Her hands were steady as she aimed at center mass, just as she had been taught. "Drop your weapon," she called out in what little Pashto she had learned, though she doubted he would comply. The insurgent's eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and rage as blood flowed from his nose where the medical bag had struck him. He raised his rifle again, and Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She pulled the trigger 3 times, the shots sounding impossibly loud in the desert air. The insurgent fell backward, his weapon clattering against the concrete. Sarah approached carefully, her pistol still ready, but she could see immediately that her shots had been fatal. Her medical instincts kicked in, and she knelt beside the man to check for signs of life, but there were none. For a moment, the contradiction of her actions hit her fully. She had just killed someone while carrying a bag full of life-saving equipment. But there was no time for reflection. The gunshots had certainly alerted other insurgents to her position, and her patients were still in danger. Sarah grabbed the fallen AK-47, checking to see if it was loaded and functional. Her familiarity with firearms from her police officer father's training served her well as she quickly assessed the weapon. It was old but well-maintained, with a full magazine. Moving toward the medical tent, Sarah could hear voices speaking in what sounded like Pashto or Dari, coming from near the generator. The insurgents were apparently trying to coordinate their next move, possibly planning to use her patients as hostages or human shields. The thought of wounded civilians and her own team members being threatened by people she could have helped medically filled her with a cold determination she had never experienced before. The pregnant woman's screams were getting more frequent and intense, indicating that the birth was progressing rapidly. Sarah knew that complications during delivery could be fatal for both mother and child without proper medical intervention. Jackson and Williams were competent medics, but they lacked her level of training for obstetric emergencies. Every minute she spent dealing with insurgents was another minute that someone might die from preventable causes. Sarah positioned herself behind a stack of medical supply boxes about 20 yards from where she could see 2 more insurgents taking cover behind the generator. They appeared to be watching the medical tent, probably waiting for the right moment to move in. She could see the barrel of one man's rifle reflecting the dim light from inside the tent where her patients waited. The tactical situation was clear, but dangerous. Sarah was outnumbered and outgunned, facing experienced fighters on terrain they had clearly scouted in advance. Her advantages were surprise, superior night vision equipment, and an intimate knowledge of the medical station layout. Most importantly, she was fighting to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, which gave her a focus that went beyond training or fear. Sarah checked her radio one more time. "Rodriguez, this is Doc Chen. I've neutralized one insurgent near the medical station, but there are at least 2 more between me and my patients. The woman in labor is progressing rapidly. I need to reach her soon, or we're going to lose her, and the baby." The response came back immediately, but it wasn't what she wanted to hear. "Doc, hold your position. We're taking heavy fire from the north perimeter, and I can't spare anyone to assist. Air support is still 5 minutes out. Can you hold until then?" Sarah looked at the medical tent, where she could see shadows moving around the lanterns. 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours when someone was bleeding out or experiencing birth complications. "Negative, Rodriguez. I'm going in now. These people are my responsibility." Sarah turned off her radio to avoid any arguments and focused entirely on the task ahead. She had never imagined that saving lives might require taking them, but the moral complexity of the situation would have to wait until everyone under her care was safe. Moving carefully through the darkness, Sarah approached the insurgents from their blind side. The AK-47 felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, so different from the medical instruments she was used to wielding with precision and confidence. But as she got closer to the generator where the men were positioned, she could hear them talking quietly in their local language, apparently planning their next move. One of the insurgents pointed toward the medical tent and said something that caused his companion to laugh quietly. Sarah didn't need to understand the language to recognize the tone. These weren't desperate fighters defending their homeland. They were predators who saw wounded people as opportunities. Any sympathy she might have felt for their cause evaporated in that moment. Sarah took a deep breath and made her presence known. "Drop your weapons and move away from the medical area," she called out in English, knowing they might not understand, but hoping her tone would communicate her seriousness. Both insurgents spun toward her voice, raising their rifles. Sarah was already aiming when they turned, and her first burst caught the nearest man in the chest before he could fire. The second insurgent managed to get off several rounds, the bullets striking the ground near Sarah's position and sending up sprays of dirt and rock fragments. Sarah rolled to her left, taking cover behind a fuel drum while returning fire. The AK-47 had more recoil than she expected, and her first shots went high, but she adjusted quickly and put 3 rounds center mass into the second insurgent. As silence fell over their small section of the battlefield, Sarah could hear the ongoing firefight at other positions around the perimeter. But for the moment, the immediate threat to her medical station had been neutralized. She approached each fallen insurgent carefully, checking to ensure they posed no further danger while her mind processed what had just happened. Sarah had killed 3 people in the space of 10 minutes. 3 people who might have families, children, reasons for being here that she would never understand. But they had also been threatening innocent people who had come seeking medical help, including a woman in labor who could die without proper care. The moral weight of her actions would stay with her forever, but she knew she had made the only choice possible under the circumstances. The sound of a baby crying suddenly cut through the night air, coming from inside the medical tent. Despite everything that had happened, life had found a way to assert itself in the middle of a war zone. Sarah holstered her pistol and picked up her medical bag, running toward the tent where her real work was waiting for her inside the medical tent. Sarah found a scene that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Corporal Jackson was kneeling beside the Afghan woman who had just given birth, holding a tiny baby who was crying with the strong, healthy wails that every medic loves to hear. Specialist Williams was working to control the mother's bleeding with supplies that were running dangerously low due to the extended firefight. Both of her team members looked up with relief when Sarah entered. "Doc, thank God you're here," Jackson said, carefully passing the newborn to Sarah. "The baby's fine, but Mom's bleeding more than we'd like. We've used most of our clotting agents on the perimeter casualties." Sarah took the baby, quickly assessing its condition with the practiced eye of someone who had delivered dozens of children in emergency situations. The infant was small, but appeared healthy, with good color and strong reflexes. Sarah handed the baby back to Jackson and turned her attention to the mother. The woman was conscious but clearly exhausted, her skin pale and clammy from blood loss. Sarah checked her pulse and blood pressure, both of which were lower than she would like, but not immediately life-threatening. The bleeding was coming from a small tear that could be sutured, but they needed to act quickly. "Williams, give me the emergency surgical kit and start another 4-line, Sarah instructed as she began preparing for the procedure. Her hands moved with automatic precision, drawing on muscle memory developed through countless medical emergencies. The sounds of gunfire continued outside, but inside the tent, her focus narrowed to the immediate medical needs of her patients. As Sarah worked to suture the tear and control the bleeding, She found herself thinking about the 3 men she had killed just minutes earlier. Their faces were already burned into her memory, but she pushed those thoughts aside. The living needed her attention more than the dead needed her guilt. There would be time later to process what had happened, but right now she had to save the life of a woman who had just brought new life into this violent world. The elderly man with a leg infection was awake, watching the proceedings with eyes that seemed to understand more than he could express in words. His 4 antibiotic drip was nearly complete, and Sarah could already see that his condition was improving. The infection that could have killed him was responding well to treatment. Another small victory in the midst of chaos. "Doc," Jackson said quietly, "Rodriguez has been trying to reach you on the radio. Something about insurgents near the medical station." Sarah realized she had turned off her radio during the firefight and quickly reactivated it. Immediately, Rodriguez's voice filled the tent with urgent questions about her status and the security situation. "Rodriguez, this is Doc Chen. Medical station is secure. I neutralized 3 insurgents who had breached the perimeter near our position. We have 1 successful birth with minor complications that are under control, and all other patients are stable." Sarah's matter-of-fact tone belied the extraordinary nature of what she was reporting. There was a pause before Rodriguez responded. "Doc, did you just say you neutralized 3 insurgents?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and respect that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to deal with. She had never wanted to be a combat hero. She just wanted to save lives and go home to her family. "Affirmative. They were threatening the medical facility and my patients. I did what was necessary." Sarah finished suturing the new mother's tear and checked her vital signs again. The bleeding had stopped, and her blood pressure was stabilizing. The woman would need close monitoring, but she should survive to raise the child who had just entered the world under such extraordinary circumstances. Air support finally arrived overhead, the distinctive sound of Apache helicopters providing a sense of security that had been missing throughout the long night. Sarah could hear the pilots coordinating with ground forces to sweep the area for any remaining insurgents. The immediate threat appeared to be over, but the psychological impact of what had happened was just beginning to settle in. As dawn broke over the Afghan landscape, Sarah found herself sitting beside the new mother, holding the baby while Williams monitored both patients. The woman had chosen to name her son Ahmad, which meant most praised in Arabic. Looking down at the peaceful face of the infant who had been born in the middle of the firefight, Sarah wondered what kind of world they were bringing children into and whether her actions had made it any safer. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the entrance to the medical tent, his face showing the strain of commanding a unit under attack all night. "Doc, I need a full report on what happened here. Command is very interested in how a field medic managed to take out 3 insurgents while delivering a baby." Sarah looked up from the infant she was holding, realizing that her night was far from over. "First, let me make sure my patients are stable," Sarah replied, handing the baby back to his mother. She checked the elderly man's leg wound one more time, satisfied that the antibiotics had prevented any serious complications. The 2 soldiers who had been wounded by shrapnel earlier were resting comfortably, their injuries minor enough that they would return to duty within a few days. Sarah gathered her team outside the medical tent to brief them on what had happened during her absence. Jackson and Williams listened with growing amazement as she described the sequence of events that led to her engaging the insurgents in combat. Neither of them had imagined that their quiet, dedicated medic would prove capable of such decisive action under extreme pressure. "Doc, you saved all of us," Williams said quietly. "If those insurgents had reached the tent while we were dealing with the birth, we would have been sitting ducks." Sarah appreciated the support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had taken lives to save lives, but the moral complexity of that equation would haunt her long after the immediate danger had passed. The investigation into the night's events began immediately. Military intelligence officers arrived by helicopter to examine the scene and interview everyone involved. Sarah found herself describing her actions in clinical detail, walking investigators through her decision-making process and the tactical considerations that led to each engagement with enemy forces. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of split-second decision-making under extreme pressure that impressed even veteran combat officers. Sarah had correctly assessed the threat to her patients, neutralized it with minimal collateral damage, and continued to provide medical care throughout the crisis. Her actions had undoubtedly saved lives, both military and civilian. But recognition for heroism was the last thing Sarah wanted. She had become a medic to heal people, not to kill them, even when killing was necessary to protect the innocent. The 3 insurgents she had killed were someone's sons, possibly fathers themselves. The fact that they had threatened her patients didn't diminish the weight of taking their lives, only justified it. Over the following days, word of Sarah's actions spread throughout the military community in Afghanistan. She found herself receiving visits from senior officers who wanted to understand how a field medic had managed such effective combat action. Some suggested she should consider transferring to a combat role, but Sarah firmly declined. Her place was with the wounded and sick, not on the front lines. The Afghan woman and her newborn son remained under Sarah's care for several more days while they recovered from birth. Through translators, Sarah learned that the woman was a widow whose husband had been killed in fighting the previous year. She had walked 12 miles to reach the medical station, hoping for help with what she knew would be a difficult birth. The elderly man with the leg infection also remained for extended treatment. Through their interactions, Sarah began to understand more about the complex realities of life in Afghanistan. He had fought against the Soviets in the 1980s, lost 2 sons to Taliban violence, and now just wanted to tend his small garden and live in peace. The piece of metal that had infected his leg was shrapnel from an explosion that had occurred years earlier. These personal connections with her patients reinforced Sarah's belief in the power of medicine to transcend political and cultural boundaries. Every person she treated was someone's family member, loved and valued regardless of their nationality or circumstances. The insurgents she had killed to protect them had also been people with families and stories, but they had chosen to threaten innocent lives. As the temporary medical station was being dismantled for relocation, Sarah took a moment to visit the spot where she had engaged the insurgents. Someone had already removed the bodies, but she could still see bullet holes in the concrete and disturbed earth where the firefight had taken place. Standing there in the bright Afghan sunlight, the events of that night seemed almost surreal. Sarah thought about the oath she had taken when she became a medic, the promise to do no harm that seemed to conflict with her actions. But she had also taken an oath to protect those under her care, and sometimes those obligations came into direct conflict. She had chosen to prioritize the protection of innocent life over the preservation of life that threatened innocence. The baby boy born during the firefight would grow up in a country still torn by conflict, but he would have a chance to grow up because his mother had received medical care when she needed it most. The elderly man would tend his garden for years to come because antibiotics had saved his leg from infection. These were the victories that mattered to Sarah, small triumphs of healing in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. As the convoy prepared to move to their next position, Sarah packed her medical bag with the same meticulous care she had always shown. But now the bag carried additional weight beyond the physical. It had been used as a weapon to save lives, just as her training and skills had been turned to purposes she had never expected. She was still a healer, but she was also something else now, someone who understood that sometimes protecting life required taking it. The transformation was complete, though Sarah didn't fully understand it yet. She remained committed to her medical mission, but she had proven to herself and others that she would do whatever was necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The quiet, dedicated medic had become a warrior, even if she didn't want to acknowledge that reality 3 weeks after the firefight that changed everything. Sarah found herself struggling with nightmares that arrived like clockwork every night around 3 in the morning. She would wake up in a cold sweat, seeing the faces of the 3 insurgents she had killed mixed with images of the baby being born and the elderly man whose leg she had saved. Sleep became elusive, and her days were marked by a hypervigilance that exhausted her both mentally and physically. The military psychiatrist assigned to their unit, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, had scheduled mandatory counseling sessions for everyone who had been involved in the incident. Sarah resented the intrusion at first, feeling that talking about what happened would only make the images more vivid and the guilt more pronounced. But after several sleepless nights and moments where she found herself freezing up during routine medical procedures, she began to see the wisdom in seeking help. "What troubles you most about that night?" Dr. Martinez asked during their 3rd session together. They were sitting in a small office that had been carved out of a converted shipping container, the walls decorated with cheerful posters that seemed absurd in the context of a war zone. Sarah had been staring at a picture of a sunset over a peaceful lake, trying to imagine being anywhere but Afghanistan. "I keep thinking about their families," Sarah replied honestly. "Those men I killed, they probably had mothers who worry about them, maybe children who are waiting for them to come home. I've spent my whole career saving lives, and in one night, I took 3 of them. I know it was necessary, I know I saved innocent people, but I can't stop thinking about the lives I ended." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding that came from years of helping soldiers process the moral complexities of combat. "It's actually a good sign that you're struggling with this, Sarah. It means your humanity is intact. The soldiers who worry me are the ones who feel nothing after taking a life. Your grief and guilt, while painful, are evidence that you haven't lost sight of the value of human life, even enemy life." The conversation helped, but it didn't stop the nightmares or the way Sarah found herself unconsciously reaching for her sidearm every time she heard unexpected noises. Her team members, Jackson and Williams, had noticed the changes in her behavior. They tried to provide support, but they were dealing with their own trauma from that night. The sound of that baby's first cry had been beautiful, but it was forever linked in their minds with gunfire and death. Sarah's reputation had spread far beyond their unit. She received a Bronze Star Medal for her actions, an honor that came with a ceremony she would have preferred to skip. Standing in front of senior officers while they read a citation describing her heroic actions in the face of enemy fire felt surreal. The words seemed to describe someone else, not the quiet medic who just wanted to help people and go home to her family. The medal brought unwanted attention from military journalists who wanted to tell the story of the field medic who had single-handedly defended her patients against insurgent attack. Sarah declined every interview request, but the story spread anyway. She began receiving letters from people back home calling her a hero, which only increased her sense of disconnection from her actions. Heroes weren't supposed to wake up screaming in the middle of the night. More concerning to Sarah was the way her medical practice had changed. She found herself constantly scanning her surroundings while treating patients, positioning herself so she always had clear lines of sight to potential threats. Her hands, which had always been steady during medical procedures, sometimes trembled when she was inserting 4 lines or suturing wounds. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during the firefight was now interfering with her ability to provide the calm, focused care her patients deserved. The Afghan woman who had given birth during the attack, Fatima, had remained in contact with Sarah through interpreters. She had named her son Ahmad, but she had also given him a middle name, Chun, in honor of the doctor who had protected them both during his birth. The gesture moved Sarah deeply, but it also reinforced the weight of responsibility she carried. This child would grow up knowing that his life had been bought with the lives of others. 4 months after the incident, Sarah's unit was transferred to a larger base where they would be supporting more complex medical operations. The change of scenery was welcome, but Sarah found that her reputation had preceded her. Other soldiers looked at her differently now, with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made her uncomfortable. She was no longer just a medic. She was the medic who had killed 3 insurgents to protect her patients. The new assignment brought its own challenges. Sarah was now working in a more established hospital facility that treated everything from routine infections to traumatic war injuries. The volume of cases was overwhelming, but she threw herself into the work with an intensity that concerned her supervisors. She was volunteering for extra shifts, staying late to check on patients, and generally avoiding any downtime that might allow her thoughts to drift back to that night. Dr. Martinez had transferred with the unit and continued Sarah's counseling sessions at the new base. During one particularly difficult session, she addressed Sarah's workaholism directly. "You're trying to save enough lives to balance out the ones you took, aren't you?" she asked. The accuracy of the observation hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing tears to her eyes for the first time since the incident. "Every patient I save feels like a small step toward redemption," Sarah admitted. "I know intellectually that what I did was justified, that those insurgents would have killed innocent people if I hadn't stopped them. But emotionally, I feel like I need to prove that I'm still a healer, not a killer. Every life I save is evidence that I haven't lost who I am." Dr. Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, you're not responsible for balancing some cosmic scale of life and death. You made split-second decisions under extreme pressure to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The fact that you're tormented by those decisions doesn't diminish their necessity. It proves your character." The breakthrough in Sarah's recovery came during a mass casualty event 6 months after the firefight. A roadside bomb had exploded near a school, injuring dozens of children and teachers. As wounded civilians flooded into their medical facility, Sarah found herself moving with the same calm precision that had characterized her work before that terrible night. Her hands were steady as she triaged patients, prioritizing the most critical cases while directing her team in treating the less severely wounded. Working to save the life of a 10-year-old girl who had suffered severe shrapnel wounds, Sarah realized that her experiences had made her a better medic, not a worse one. She was more aware of security concerns, more decisive under pressure, and more protective of her patients than ever before. The violence she had been forced to commit had not corrupted her medical mission. It had refined and strengthened it. As the girl's vital signs stabilized and Sarah moved on to the next patient, she felt something shift inside her. The guilt and self-doubt that had plagued her for months didn't disappear, but they transformed into a deeper understanding of her role as a healer. Sometimes protecting life required taking life, and she was prepared to make that choice again if necessary. The letters from home had continued throughout her recovery process. Her family wrote regularly, expressing pride in her service while worrying about her safety. Her brother Marcus, who was serving with an infantry unit in another part of Afghanistan, had written after hearing about the incident. His letter was brief, but powerful. "Sis, you did what any good soldier would do. You protected the people who couldn't protect themselves. Don't let anyone tell you that being a healer and being a warrior are contradictory. Sometimes they're the same thing." Sarah began responding to some of the interview requests from military journalists, but only to tell the story she wanted told. She spoke about the importance of medical care in winning hearts and minds about the Afghan civilians who had trusted American medics with their lives and health, and about the complexity of serving in a role that required both compassion and steel. The reporters who expected simple hero narratives often left disappointed, but Sarah wasn't interested in simple stories. During one interview, a journalist asked Sarah if she would do the same thing again, knowing what she knew now about the psychological cost. Sarah thought for a long moment before answering. "I would do it exactly the same way," she said. "The nightmares, the guilt, the questioning, they're the price I pay for saving innocent lives. Those 3 insurgents made a choice to threaten people under my care. I made a choice to stop them. I can live with my choice." The transformation was becoming more apparent to everyone around her. Sarah had evolved from a skilled but conventional field medic into something more complex. A medical professional who understood that sometimes the Hippocratic Oath directive to do no harm required doing harm to those who threatened the innocent. She had found a way to reconcile her roles as healer and protector though the reconciliation came with permanent changes to her psyche. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah began training replacements who would take over the medical mission. Teaching new medics about the realities of combat medicine, she emphasized not just the technical skills they would need, but the mental preparation required for situations that might force them to use their weapons. Her experiences had taught her that the line between combatant and non-combatant was often much blurrier than training manuals suggested. The woman who would eventually return to civilian life was fundamentally different from the idealistic young medic who had deployed to Afghanistan. Sarah had learned that the world was more complicated than she had imagined, that good people sometimes had to do terrible things to protect what was precious. She had paid a psychological price for that knowledge, but she had also gained a deeper understanding of her own capabilities and convictions. Her last month in Afghanistan was spent at the same forward operating base where her transformation had begun. Walking through the area where the temporary medical station had been set up, Sarah could still see traces of that night. Scorch marks on concrete where grenades had exploded, bullet holes in walls that had been repaired but not perfectly covered. The physical evidence of violence was fading, but the memories remained as vivid as ever 2 years after returning from Afghanistan. Sarah stood in the emergency room of Chicago General Hospital, the same trauma unit where her journey had begun. But she was no longer the naive young medic who had left for deployment. The woman who worked the night shift now moved with a confidence and awareness that impressed her colleagues and sometimes unsettled patients who weren't used to medical professionals who seemed to be constantly scanning for threats. The transition back to civilian medicine had been more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. During her first week back, a car backfiring in the hospital parking lot had sent her diving for cover behind a concrete planter, much to the amazement of other staff members. Simple situations that would never have bothered her before deployment now triggered hypervigilance responses that took months to moderate. Dr. Robert Chun, the chief of emergency medicine and no relation despite the shared surname, had been understanding about Sarah's adjustment period. He had served as a Navy corpsman in Iraq and recognized the signs of combat stress in her behavior. Rather than viewing her military experience as a liability, he saw it as an asset that brought valuable skills to their civilian practice. Sarah, we've got a multi-vehicle accident coming in, 7 casualties, including 3 children, Dr. Chin announced during a particularly busy Friday night shift. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied mass casualty situations, but now was tempered by experience and training that went far beyond what most civilian medics possessed. Her time in Afghanistan had taught her to remain calm in chaos and to make life and death decisions with clarity and speed. The accident victims began arriving within minutes, carried in by paramedics who were clearly overwhelmed by the severity of the injuries. Sarah immediately began triaging patients, using skills honed in combat zones to quickly assess who needed immediate attention and who could wait. Her Afghan experience had taught her to make these decisions without the luxury of extensive consultation or second-guessing. Working on a 6-year-old boy with internal bleeding, Sarah found herself thinking about Ahmad, the baby born during the firefight. He would be walking now, probably starting to talk, growing up in a country still torn by conflict, but alive because of decisions made during one violent night. The connection between past and present gave Sarah's work a deeper meaning than just treating injuries. She was part of a continuum of healing that spanned continents and cultures. The boy's injuries were severe, but treatable with immediate surgery. As Sarah stabilized his condition and prepared him for the operating room, she marveled at the resources available in American hospitals compared to what she had worked with in Afghanistan. Here, they had unlimited supplies, advanced equipment, and teams of specialists. There, she had often saved lives with basic supplies and determination alone. Between patients during the busy night, Sarah's colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, approached her with curiosity about her military service. "I've noticed you handle trauma cases differently than most of us," Dr. Walsh said. "There's a calmness about you, even when things are chaotic. The military training really shows." Sarah appreciated the observation, but wasn't sure how to explain that her calmness came not just from training, but from having faced situations where medical work was complicated by people trying to kill her patients. "The military taught me to focus on what I can control," Sarah replied. "In Afghanistan, we often had to work under conditions that were far from ideal. You learn to adapt and to prioritize what really matters." She didn't mention the nightmares that still visited her, though less frequently than during her first year back. Some experiences were too complex to explain to people who hadn't lived them. The recognition Sarah had received for her military service had followed her into civilian life. Medical journals had published articles about battlefield medicine that featured her experiences, and she had been invited to speak at conferences about trauma care under extreme conditions. These speaking engagements were uncomfortable for Sarah, who still struggled with being called a hero, but she recognized their value in advancing medical practice. During one such conference in Denver, Sarah met Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a military psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans. Dr. Rodriguez had read about Sarah's case and was interested in studying the psychological impact of military medics who had been forced to engage in combat. "Your experience represents a unique intersection of healing and violence that we don't fully understand," Dr. Rodriguez explained. The research project that grew out of their meeting would eventually help other military medics who found themselves in similar situations. Sarah's willingness to discuss her experiences openly, despite the personal cost, provided insights that informed training programs and counseling protocols for combat medics. Her story became a case study in moral injury and recovery that helped dozens of other veterans process their own complex experiences. Sarah's family had struggled to understand the changes in her personality after deployment. Her parents noticed that she was more serious, less trusting of strangers, and prone to startling at unexpected noises. Her brother Marcus, who had also returned from Afghanistan, understood better than most what she was dealing with. During family gatherings, they would often find themselves talking quietly about experiences that others couldn't comprehend. "Do you ever regret going?" Marcus asked during one of these conversations. They were sitting on their parents' back porch, watching their nephews play in the yard while the rest of the family prepared dinner inside. Sarah considered the question carefully, as she always did when asked about her military service. "I regret the violence," Sarah answered honestly. "I regret that 3 men died because of choices I made, even though I know those choices were necessary. But I don't regret serving. The people we helped, the lives we saved, that matters. Ahmad matters. The old man with the infected leg matters. All the patients who receive care they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, they all matter." The nightmares had evolved over time, becoming less frequent, but more vivid when they occurred. Dr. Martinez, who Sarah still saw occasionally for counseling, explained that this was normal for people who had experienced moral injury. "Your subconscious is still processing the complexity of what happened," she said. "The fact that you did the right thing doesn't eliminate the psychological impact of taking lives. That's what makes you human." 5 years after the firefight, Sarah received a letter that changed her perspective on everything that had happened. It was from Fatima, the woman who had given birth during the attack, written with the help of an American aid worker who was teaching literacy classes in her village. The letter was simple but powerful. "Ahmad is in school now. He is smart and kind. He wants to be a doctor like the woman who saved us. I tell him about the American lady who protected us when he was born. You are in our prayers every day." Reading the letter in her apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Sarah finally understood that her actions that night had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate violence. A child was growing up who might become a healer himself, inspired by a story of protection and care that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. The 3 lives she had taken had enabled countless others to continue, including a boy who might grow up to save lives himself. Sarah had also maintained contact with Jackson and Williams, her team members from that night. Jackson had left the military and become a paramedic in Houston, while Williams had stayed in the Army and was now training new medics at Fort Sam Houston. When they met for reunions, Usually around the anniversary of the firefight, they would share stories about how that night continued to influence their work and their understanding of their roles as healers. I tell the new medics that sometimes protecting life requires taking life, Williams explained during their most recent reunion. It's the hardest lesson in combat medicine, but it's one that could save their lives and the lives of their patients. Your example gives them a framework for understanding how to be both a healer and a protector. The speaking engagements have become more comfortable for Sarah over time, though she still felt awkward being called a hero. Her presentations focused less on the violence she had committed and more on the medical lessons learned from providing care under extreme conditions. She emphasized the importance of mental health support for combat medics and the need for training that prepared medical personnel for the full range of situations they might face in war zones. During one presentation at a military medical conference, a young corpsman asked Sarah if she would do the same thing again, knowing what she knew about the psychological cost. It was a question she had been asked many times, but her answer had evolved over the years. "I would do it exactly the same way," Sarah replied, "but I would also make sure I had better psychological preparation for the aftermath. The taking of life, even when necessary to protect the innocent, changes you permanently. That change isn't necessarily bad, but it's profound, and people need to be prepared for it." Sarah's work at Chicago General had earned her promotion to supervisor of the emergency trauma unit, a position that allowed her to train new nurses and residents in the kind of crisis management she had learned in Afghanistan. Her teaching emphasized not just technical skills, but mental resilience and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, whether from disease, injury, or violence. The woman who had once worried about reconciling her roles as healer and protector had found peace in understanding that they were not contradictory, but complementary. Her experiences had made her a better medic, a more thoughtful person, and eventually a mentor to others who face similar challenges. The guilt had never completely disappeared, but it had been joined by pride in her service and confidence in her choices. As Sarah prepared to leave for another shift at the hospital, she looked at the framed photo on her dresser, a picture of her team from Afghanistan, taken a few days before the firefight that changed everything. Jackson and Williams were smiling in their combat gear, surrounded by the medical equipment that represented their mission to heal in a place torn by violence. Sarah barely recognized the young woman in the center of the photo, but she was proud of who that woman had become. The journey from idealistic medic to battle-tested healer had been painful, but ultimately transformative. Sarah had learned that the world was more complex than textbooks suggested, that good people sometimes had to make terrible choices, and that taking life to protect life was not a contradiction, but sometimes a necessity. She carried the weight of those lessons with her every day, but she also carried the knowledge that her actions had mattered, that lives had been saved, and that even in the darkest moments, healing was possible. Walking into Chicago General for another night shift, Sarah Chun remained what she had always been at heart, a healer. But she was also something more now, something forged in the crucible of combat and tempered by years of reflection and service. She was a protector, a teacher, and a living example of the complexity of moral courage in an imperfect world.